Everyone, this is Janice Perkins. I think we're about to get started. If you're joining me today, we are talking about uncovering the pitfalls of a leader, why leaders get stuck. And on your toolbar, if you've Zoom meeting before, there are a couple different things that you can use. The Q&A is there if you have a question to ask me, or raise your hand if you have a question and I haven't noticed that there's a question in the queue. So that is there for you to use as a tool. And you can also just text or email me if you have my contact information. I have it on a slide near the end so that you can email me if you have follow-up questions as well. So the reason I wanted to use this webinar as something that we could dive into in today's climate with coronavirus and all the different decisions businesses are having to make right now is that it really helps us understand what our internal traps are when we make decisions. So that's one of the reasons why it's a great topic for today. And I hope that you enjoy it. And I hope it's something that you can take back to your leadership team and your company as you help make decisions today with all these uncertain times going on. So a lot of times, the guy with the quicksand, I use that as a funny story because one time when I was traveling to Florida for business with a colleague, we were going to New Smyrna Beach, Florida, which is right on the coast just south of Daytona. And it's the place in Florida where the beach is really flat and there's a road on the beach and a parking lot when you go out there. And when we first arrived, because we're landlocked Kansans, we immediately took the rental car to drive out to walk on the beach before we even checked into the hotel and had our first meeting. And I was driving, and it happened to be a rear-wheel drive rental car, which only makes sense in a minute. But I was following all the other cars into the sand parking lot, and somehow I turned in a little shallow. And because it was rear wheel drive, I was in the looser sand and I got stuck right when I pulled into the sandy parking lot. And I did what a country girl is taught to do. And when you're stuck in the mud or the ice, you kind of rock out by going drive, reverse, except that when you're on sand, all that does is actually dig you deeper. And so within a matter of 20 seconds, we are like bumper deep in the sandy parking lot. So to my own embarrassment, and my colleague laughing really hard at me, it took 3 or 4 grown men to help push us out of the rut that I had created. And I tell that story because it's incredibly embarrassing and vulnerable for me to talk about, but also because it's what we do when we're making decisions as leaders is we tend to make the same kinds of decisions and double down, and we just create ruts for ourselves. So it's one of the reasons why walking through this is really helpful, because it helps us evaluate ourselves and where we have been creating similar pathways and not enabling ourselves to see all the different choices we can make when we're faced with tough decisions. So I encourage you as we walk through all these steps to just kind of take note of some major decisions that you're facing right now, personally or professionally, and see if these steps as you walk through them and take notes kind of help you unlock some of the places where you felt stuck. So the first step is actually evaluating the circumstances. So I use this one as the first slide, and it's on fire because a lot of times we're set up for failure in the circumstances that we're facing. So for instance, if you're from Wichita, there are all kinds of different examples I could give you. I'm sure that you have some when you're in your own home cities as well. But there are certain locations, and in Wichita, there's one on 37th and Rock Road, where it's a restaurant building location, in which multiple restaurants have tried to open. And you keep wondering, why do other restaurants keep opening up in those buildings? It's clearly the wrong location because restaurants keep failing there over and over and over again. And sometimes we have to look at our circumstance and see if it was set up for failure before we even continue to make decisions about it. So for instance, you could have been faced with a very tough decision considering an employee or a service or product And now you're looking at that dilemma in light of the current climate and coronavirus, and it capitulates or exacerbates the problem by making it larger. So what you need to do is evaluate what the circumstance was at ground zero and what that would have looked like before it was handed to you. So this happens in our culture, corporate culture, when we're handed a department in which the 3 previous leaders were all, their longevity was not longer than 6 or 9 months. And all of a sudden you're faced with a department that has really terrible culture or mismanagement, inappropriate budgeting, as well as toxic employees. And you were set up for failure before you even started. So what you do is just take a look at what the circumstances were before this coronavirus event to see if the problem was there to start with, and it's now just gotten larger, and this uncovered the problem larger, or if it's something you were already wrestling with, this just in light of new circumstances makes it added fuel to the fire, so to speak. So just chart that out. It's sometimes it's as easy as a pro and con list, but it's really looking at a timeline of events. So we can't start looking at how to make a decision if we can't start on solid ground. And for instance, when I ran in track in high school, the starting blocks have to be anchored for you to get a good start. And if they're not anchored, and we went to a pretty small country school, you had to have one of your teammates stand on your starting blocks, and they needed to be heavier than you in order for the blocks to be anchored, because they couldn't spike them into certain tracks that we ran on. So you have to have solid ground in order to start making a good decision. And this is part of that. It's taking a look at the circumstance and the validity of the circumstance before you're able to even make a decision about it. So take some time to take some notes on that as we continue to move forward about the circumstance. This slide isn't probably as appropriate for the topic today, but it's still something that you should consider. It's something that I always mention when I'm talking about making decisions. As leaders, a lot of times we're set up for failure because we're also put into positions of leadership without proper preparation and training. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times, oh my gosh, you are so great at sales, you should be the sales manager. Or you're the best welder on our floor and you're great at training, so you should be the manager or the supervisor of the floor. And a lot of times we just think that the talent of the skill means that you're automatically qualified to lead, and that's not always the case. Sometimes people have innate leadership skills, but most of the time it needs to be trained. How do I manage? How do I manage schedules, budgets, people, toxicity, conflict, all of those things? And in one particular study, organizations of 100 to 500 employees reportedly only spent 6 minutes every 6 months training their managers on how to lead. So that's really an incredibly low number. So as you walk through this climate, you have to take into account a couple things that usually get knocked out of the budget really fast. One I'm going to talk about today, but it's at the heart of my training as well, and it's marketing. And a lot of times when we're looking at budget and how to get through a down market and difficulty, companies immediately pull back all their marketing budget. And that's not the smartest decision to make. So that's something for a separate topic. But the other one is training, and it's something that gets pulled out very quickly. And in this kind of market, your managers and supervisors actually need more training on how to handle conflict and the tough decisions that they're faced with as well. If you're having layoffs or you're shutting down services or actually even temporarily closing, is that you need to continue to perpetuate positive training and self-awareness into the leaders that you have so that they're equipped to continue running the business remotely or when you pick back up in a few weeks, and that there isn't a genuine sense that confidence is waning. Doing a lot of what I would call internal PR is really great in a time like this for your employees. It builds confidence in the decisions that you're making and how you communicate that to people. So hopefully that is something that you can benefit from in a different light as we talk about the climate we're in now. Okay, moving on. The next step is self-examination. And this is one of my favorite steps. And I want you to seriously take time. I'm going to give you a few minutes to write some things down. And in the self-examination, I'm not talking about genuine bad habits, faults, traits, lack of knowledge. You know, we all have true limits. Okay. You don't ever want me to do your taxes. I don't have a detail score high enough that enables me to do things like taxes and accounting, even though I know how to do them for my business. It's not something that I would do for my profession. So we can all be trained to have competency, but it's not something that's our talent or our gift. And so when we have true limits, that's not what we're talking about when we're doing self-examination. When you're trying to make tough decisions, what I want you to look at is what I call the tend to list. And a lot of times when we're in a group training with your leadership team, this is a great exercise to do with all of them together, is to talk about what your tend tos are. Like, I tend to over control. I tend to not delegate when I'm stressed out and think I should do all of the work because then that gets done right. I tend to make knee-jerk decisions. I tend to not make decisions. There are all kinds of tend tos, overspenders, procrastinators. I tend to overthink a problem to death. I tend to get overwhelmed when I have to make tough decisions. So I want you to write down, take about 30, 40 seconds here and write down some of your tend tos. These are really helpful when you look at how you get stuck. And if you don't know what your tend tos are, ask your spouse or one of your colleagues that works with you every day. It was really helpful for someone else to give you perspective. Unfortunately, we don't always like to see that, but sometimes we limit our own self-examination by not seeing ourselves the way other people see us. So being open and vulnerable to let other people help you make your tend to list is incredibly eye-opening, as well as it unearths a lot of things that can help you get unstuck in making a decision. So take a few more seconds here, and I'm going to sip my tea while you make your tend to list. Okay. I'm very impatient, so I never know how much time has actually passed. As you're making your self-examination list on your tend tos, the next step that you need to jot some things down on is looking at the problem. Now, we've eliminated a few other variables that hopefully is helping you see your decision or the choices of your decision in a different light. But sometimes we have to really examine what's making a decision difficult. Is it because it's risky? Is it hard? Is it just something that I don't like to do when it comes to personnel decisions? There are some people who struggle with personnel decisions more than others. If you're familiar with the process communication model that I train on by Dr. Taby Kaler, and you know what your personality types are, promoters and persisters don't have difficulty making tough decisions. They usually are able to pull the trigger very well. But as we'll see through some of the steps we're going to look at, depending on your base personality type, it depends what well of information that you're deriving the knowledge from to make that decision. And persisters and promoters pull from two totally different places. So sometimes you have to look at the problem. Is it because I don't like the choices that I'm left with? And a lot of time that's what it is. So for instance, you could be looking at the problem and it could be about a toxic employee that you were having difficulty with even before the new societal events of social distancing and coronavirus have arrived. And that employee is related to someone else or was hired by the former board president or has been in the company for 25 years. There are all kinds of factors that add on to the problem. And what you do is you have to list those out. So you have to separate the actual problem from the other factors that you're adding to it, or what choices that leaves you with. Can you shift that person to another position? Can you lay that position off? You know, what are the factors that are limiting your choices? So one of the stories that I tell that's really funny is in my hometown, there are only two bars that you could drink at, really. And one of them is where all the teachers and policemen and everyone else hung out. And the other one was down kind of what we called Skid Row, and it was called Sonny's. And that's where we would always go and drink beer when we'd be home from college. Over the holidays, that's where everybody would get together. And at Sonny's, you could only drink beer out of a can. He served Bush, Bud, and Pabst Blue Ribbon out of a can. And we were there over one particular holiday, and my brother-in-law was from Baltimore, and he didn't really understand the concept of having only three choices. And he went over to ask Sonny, who owned the bar and bartended, if he could have a Rolling Rock. And, you know, he looked at him with the craziest look on his face, and we all erupted with laughter. But the problem was he didn't like the choices in front of him, so he was trying to make a new choice, which is sometimes what we try to do in circumstances like this. And sometimes we need to make a new choice. And so you really examining the problem and trying to figure out what options you actually have. A lot of times there are options that exist that we're just not willing to consider, but are worth putting down on paper. So laying off an employee for some reason might not be an option that you're willing to consider, but it needs to be an option that you put on the page because it's part of a choice. And possibly as we continue to go through the decision-making steps, you can see the light of that choice in a new way, and it will enable you to see how it's possible. So don't exclude choices, and look for alternate choices as well as you look at the problem. And the other thing to consider is looking at what you're adding to the problem, and make sure that you're extracting the lowest common denominator. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay, the next step, this is another deeper level of self-examination of why I'm really stuck. And so when my daughter was little, she struggled with learning to swim, not because just the skill, but because she had a very deep fear of water. And so we spent the first few years of swimming lessons just trying to teach her how to not be afraid of the water. And as we got into the third summer, you know, we were in the pool, she was learning to swim, but she was still not able to put her face in the water. So we would practice in the bathtub, and then she would get into the pool and she would scream bloody murder, and it, you know, and make everybody stare. It was fantastic. And so one particular day we were practicing in the bathtub, and I was asking her why it was so easy to put her face in the water and blow bubbles in the bathtub, but not in the swimming pool. And she simply looked at me and said, well, because there's a deep end in the swimming pool. And I said, well, but you're not anywhere close to the deep end. You've never been in the deep end. It's way across the rope. You're with the instructor. I don't know why the deep end's bothering you. And she repeated to me, well, the way she said it was, but I can see the deep end from there. And so one of the things that this step really does is has each of us look at what is the deep end of the pool that really is kind of in the distance that could be possibly getting me stuck. And we have these things within ourselves. They're internal traps. They're the sharks in the water, and they're underneath the surface of all the decisions that we make. We are motivated by positive and negative. When we make decisions, we have a positive motivation to succeed and some other things internal to ourselves that we're trying to achieve, but we also are motivated by the negative. And I explain it this way to people is that I run for exercise for my health, but I also could be running from a bear. So I have the same action, but I'm motivated by two different things. And so we have to really examine what our internal motivation is when we're making a decision to see if our trap is the reason why we're stuck. And so when I reach an impasse, a lot of times there are 6 basic things that can get me stuck. And it can be grief or loss, fear, responsibility, powerlessness, vulnerability, or anger. And if you take the tough decision that you're looking at, I put these in the form of questions because a lot of times it helps, is to take a look at these 6 questions and try to determine which of these could be getting you stuck and could be causing that trap, or that I'm digging down into the sand and creating a rut. a lot of times it's one of these questions. Sometimes there's more than one, but usually it's one that we really struggle with in our base personality. So ask yourself these 6 questions and just circle or jot down the one that's causing you the most issue, and try to unwrap the layers of that within the context of that problem. So what am I going to lose? What am I afraid of? What am I feeling responsible for? What is making me feel powerless? What am I unable to be vulnerable about? Or what am I not allowing myself to be angry about? And so I'm going to put these in the context of the situation I was talking about. Let's say it's a toxic employee that you were already struggling with before the issue of coronavirus came up. And now the problem is even more exacerbated, and you're having to look at layoffs and budgets. So if you're struggling with loss, what am I going to lose? You could be a trap underneath the surface of that decision, because you're afraid to lose the depth of knowledge that that person does have in the organization if they've been there 25 years, that you're afraid to lose that depth of knowledge and what that would mean for the organization. So you need to walk through the steps of what that means and how you would disseminate or download the experience and knowledge, or allow that person to be a consultant or part-time as you exit that position from the company. There are different ways to look at that, and I can help you walk through some of those decisions if that's something you're faced with. What am I afraid of? And the persister is the person who really struggles with fear in this type of decision. And that's looking at, am I afraid of what that means if I get rid of that person for the department? Am I afraid of the backlash of the employees? Am I afraid of what the president of the board of directors could do to me if they're related to that person? There are all kinds of fear threads that you have to chase all the way down to the end of that fear to understand what the final domino is that's causing you to feel trapped. What am I feeling responsible for? This could also be, what am I not wanting to be responsible for? Either one of those things can put this particular personality in possession of a trap, because the weight or burden of the responsibility can just be, can have too much gravity on that person. So it's taking a look at offloading some responsibility or the ability to delegate on the rest of the team, and that can alleviate this trap. What is making me feel powerless? I had a director of a nonprofit say to me at one point, and her nonprofit organization, she's the only paid employee. Her entire organization is built up of volunteers. And this one really struck her heart. And she said, that's what gets me frozen some days, as I feel so powerless to my volunteer army, that what would happen if someone didn't show up or they weren't there to continue the organization? I couldn't succeed. And so she understood what that inner trap was in light of the word powerlessness. What am I unable to be vulnerable about? This is really about digging deep into being honest with your executive team or your management team or your board of directors. At times, it's hard to say, I'm facing a tough decision and I'm not sure what to do. And being vulnerable enough to be open about a trap, about a feeling, about the reverberations or consequences of a decision is really more about being vulnerable inside. And so it's understanding if it's my inner vulnerability that's not able to make this decision, because it means I have to be open and honest about what I'm struggling with. What am I not allowing myself to be angry about? There are certain people that have an inner trap that doesn't want to address anger. It doesn't want to express anger. And that particular personality type really has to understand if it's about betrayal, if it's about loss, and it could be processing that through the lens of anger is the real struggle. And you just have to walk through that emotional journey to decide if anger is the trap underneath your inability to make that decision. And I can follow through with any of you later on who's really struggling with any of these 6 questions. But they are traps that we have to uncover. And I hope that's helpful and you've identified more than one question, at least one that can help you. Okay, so we'll get out of the deep end of the pool for a minute because that's some pretty deep self-examination. This is one of my favorite parts of helping you make a decision when it comes to the four quadrants, I call them. So a lot of times we as individuals tend to make decisions out of one or more of these quadrants, but not usually all four, and certainly not three or four. But the four quadrants are external, internal, withdrawing, and involving. And external means I'm going to make decisions based on external facts. So I'm going to gather information and data, and I'm going to base my decision on factual information. The internal is that I'm going to base my decision on my internal gut, my experience, and history that I know that's gone on. That's internal. Withdrawing means that I'm going to make my decision after I have thought about it over the weekend. I'm going to go off by myself. I'm going to sleep on it, and I'm going to let that decision marinate, and I'm going to do that on my own. Involving means I'm going to make a decision using my colleagues, my experience, my spouse, some mentors, some other business vendors that I know that I trust and value their opinion. And I'm going to involve people and gather from their experience to help me make a decision. So in these four quadrants, we tend to sit in one or two of them to make our decisions. And what I really want to challenge you to do is I want to challenge you to write down the one or two quadrants that you do tend to use most often. And when you're stuck in a decision, you need to step into the ones you don't. And that can really help you get unstuck. So if I tend to make my decisions based on my internal experience and on my gut, then I need to stop and gather external data and information and add that to my internal experience and see if that helps me make a more valid decision when I'm stuck. If I tend to remove myself and sleep on a decision and marinate on it alone, I need to also involve others and gather information and experience from other people around me to add to that decision. So it doesn't eliminate the value of the quadrant that you're strong in. It just means that when you're stuck, you need to step into multiple quadrants, or I would challenge you to step in all four of them when you're really stuck in making a decision. And this usually is one of the last steps that helps people eliminate that feeling of being stuck or not feeling value in the decision or the choices that they're faced with, is doing these all four. So I want you to just jot down really quick which quadrant you need to work on or which quadrant you have not actually involved in the current decisions that you're making. And we just have a couple more steps left. And knowing this as you move forward helps you make ongoing decisions more fluid in your personal life as well as your professional life, because we all tend to just have a quadrant that we're the most comfortable with. And when you look at all four of them, you think, wow, I've been making decisions out of one of those quadrants my entire career or life and had no idea I wasn't using the other two or three as often. And it enables you to see the value in stepping outside of those things for helping you make different types of decisions as you move forward. It's not because every single decision that you're faced with means that you shouldn't step out of your strong quadrant. It's what's made you successful in where you are as a leader. It just means that you need to deepen your bench. And it's the breadth and width that enables you to make more valid decisions as you move forward. Okay. One of the final steps is examining perspective. So it has a little bit to do with examining the problem that we did earlier, because the perspective, and I literally, when I do this in a team environment, I have people get up and change chairs where they're sitting in a room. And I would encourage you to examine physical perspective as well as mental and emotional perspective. So if you and your team are trying to make difficult decisions and you always meet in the boardroom to hash them out, you should meet somewhere different, because physical perspective actually changes the way we look at situations. So change where you're sitting, change where you're making the decision, change where you're doing the brainstorming, especially faced with a difficult decisions that all of you are facing right now is to change the perspective and the value of the room in which you're trying to make that decision. And then also, it's partly examining that problem again. Am I adding to the problem that I'm looking at the problem from a completely different place? So if you are doing this in a team environment and you have your whole C-suite employees there, your financial person, have someone else facilitate the conversation that hasn't. So do it from a financial perspective, do it from a marketing perspective versus just a CEO perspective as the leader. So allowing someone else to present the perspective and the issue from the way they see it really enables everything to look differently. It's like flipping it on a pancake. So, and it allows you to also boil the problem down to that lowest common denominator that we talked about. So as a leader, you might be looking at the problem with 5 different factors, but in essence, the problem itself only has one factor. The problem is that department is not producing the way it should, and that particular employee has declined in their production every single year for 5 years straight. That's the problem. But yes, the additional issue is that problem, that person, if we use that example, that employee is also a toxic employee and adds and devalues the team because they create drama or conflict that's unnecessary. But it's really about the producing of product or service that is beneficial to the margin and the bottom line of the company. So you boil it down to the lowest common denominator and find that, and then look at it from the financial, the marketing, the operations perspective, and technical perspective as well, and see if that changes how you view the decision that has to be made or the choices that are on the table. And that can really help. So the last step in the process really is, it has to do with time. So it's really imagining, am I standing in the past, present, or future? And to take a look at how all 3 of these are factoring into the way you're making a decision. So for instance, if it has to do with an employee and they've been an employee for 25 years, am I looking at the history going back to how they added value 20, 25 years ago? Yes, that is something I should take into consideration. But today, in the present time, that employee is currently not as valuable as they used to be because of toxicity, drama, a lack of resources, a lack of contribution to the organization. I have to look at it in the present. I also have to evaluate whether I'm looking at the problem in light of the future. Am I looking at what will happen or what could happen? And I'm putting too much weight on the future that is uncertain versus, but today, the organization would best be served by. So, and a lot of times you have to take a look at what that present timeline is. And for some organizations, it's important that the timeline is like a 3-month timeline, that I'm making the decision on the best thing for this organization in the quarter. Or it's based on the best decision I can make for this year. And you just need to keep that decision in the present time narrow enough, but not too narrow. You don't want it to make the decision based on just this week. Okay, even though that's very difficult right now with what's going on with coronavirus, the window is narrow, and it's much more narrow than we realize, I believe, for the changes that are coming. But economically, that window might be broader, and it might be a year versus 2 months. So take a look at the present definition, and when you're trying to slate that decision, define it over, would I make the decision different if it was only a week, only 2 months, or a year? And make sure that you're not bringing in too much of the past or the future into that decision, but take those into consideration to weigh, but the decision needs to be on what's best for the corporation in the present time. So limit that choice and see how that changes what the choices are in front of you and how that helps you make a decision. It's part of just evaporating the things that can be peeled off so that you're left with more clarity. So as we walk through these steps, I just want to conclude by saying, hopefully the decision that you are struggling with right now, or some of the decision, at least you have more confidence developing a decision making process that provides clarity at the end of it, or discernment when you're making that decision. Can you rip the Band-Aid off? Does it feel like you're able to pull the trigger more, understanding your internal trap and what's in front of you? If you want to walk through this in more in depth, I can do that with each one of you separately. I am so glad that you joined me today. I'm going to put up my contact information in case you don't have it. You can email or text me, call me if you have any needs. I'm going to, I've recorded this webinar so that I can post it later. If you want to share it with your team, I can send you a link to do that. I appreciate you joining me today, and am really excited that you were able to join and that we have the technological ability to do things like this. So I hope you have a great day, a great week, and I look forward to following up with you soon.